I decided to preach this sermon on a whim. That's a little bit of a dangerous thing to do. I heard somebody in the front row go, "Oh!" It's the same one on the board out there, don't worry. But there's always a risk when one does that as the Sunday draws near, I'll find out that my passion for a particular topic can really be summed up in about 3 sentences. Or that I'll find out it's not as interesting as I thought. Ralph Waldo Emerson once remarked that a treatise, convention, or lecture on education affects us with a slight paralysis and a certain yawning of the jaws. Well, I hope that's not the case. I don't think it will be, because education is a fascinating matter from many different angles: faith, democracy, justice. I was at a meeting of Albuquerque Interfaith when I made the decision. That's an organization here in town that gets diverse people together to speak with one voice about issues of public concern. They've lobbied the city and the legislature on issues from economics to immigration, and right now they're taking up education, because this is a very tough moment for our teachers and kids. I was at this meeting with about 300 other people. Some were teachers, and they were getting up to tell the group about their experience of a new teacher evaluation system in New Mexico. Some of the teachers were members of this congregation. The stories went something like this. A teacher is graded based on how their students do on a standardized test. Each year, their class takes the test once, and each fall, the teachers get a whole new class. Now, the problem with this system is that the test does not measure the teacher's progress from one point in time to another with the same group of kids. It just takes a snapshot of where the group of kids are at a certain point in the year. And if they don't meet a certain benchmark, the teacher gets a low score. Well, you can imagine the frustration of a teacher whose new group of students each year includes a lot of kids with disadvantages, kids who are still trying to learn English, kids who've had little or no health care, or who haven't had adequate nutrition, or who haven't slept well because their homes include poverty or abuse. Those classes are behind to start with, and the teachers are supposed to somehow close the gap in 1 year in time for the test. They try their best, but without being able to address the underlying issues, there's only so much even a very good teacher can do. One teacher shared that she earned a high score, an A, in the teacher grading system when she worked at a public school in a wealthier part of town, but when she moved to a low-income area where presumably good teachers are especially needed, she was only able to score a D. It's hard to imagine that she became a worse teacher when she moved to where her skills seemed especially needed, but that's how the ranking system saw it. Now, this has huge consequences for our school system. Albuquerque Public Schools is losing teachers this year, many of them to early retirement, because they don't want to end their careers by being penalized under a system that seems to defy logic. I'm no historian or philosopher of education. I'm not a policy expert, and I've never worked as a school teacher myself, but I care. And like many people here, I've been involved in it most of my life. I went to public schools as a kid and then was lucky to go on to college and graduate school. Between my son and my daughter, I have 18 years of experience as a parent in public schools. I've served on a PTO, or parent-teacher organization, as secretary for 2 years and as co-chair for 1 at Jefferson Middle School. So I'm preaching from the perspective of involvement and as an educated person and a mother. I'm speaking as someone who lives in a society that's influenced by and has influence according to the education of its people. As someone who lives in a democracy, the well-being of which depends on having a well-educated populace. And I speak as a minister. And this is important because education is a deeply spiritual undertaking. It's something theologians and philosophers have discussed and written about across the ages. On the order of service today, there's a quote from Proverbs. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let it go. Guard wisdom, for she is your life. It's from a section of Hebrew scriptures that dates back thousands of years. In it, a religious teacher is exhorting his student to take up the course of wisdom, to take teaching seriously and let them guide his life. It's about more than religious rules. It's about ways of interpreting the world. During the Enlightenment in the 1700s, philosophers recognized education as the path to fulfilling human potential, living into our full humanity. And Lydia Maria Child and Horace Mann and other famous Unitarians and Universalists have linked their faith with education and the sincere goals of democracy and have played a huge role in America's public education system. Why is it so spiritual? Since we're conscious and we have memories, we have the ability to store up and pass on information. When some people think of education, they stop right there. We think of it as passing information from teacher to student. This is the kind of education many tests measure. When we talk about cramming for a test, we're talking about filling our heads up with bits of information that we can reproduce on demand. But that's not the whole picture. Consciousness gives us not only the ability to amass information, but the ability to be aware of consciousness itself and apply information to it in such a way that we change it. A good education changes our consciousness. Sometimes people worry about that. I saw a guy in Costco the other day wearing a t-shirt that said, "I survived college without becoming a liberal." I don't know about that. But awakening consciousness, or conscientization, was the great goal of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. He criticized what he called the banking concept of education, in which the student was viewed as an empty account to be filled up by the teacher. He said a teacher's job is to help students learn to be aware of their own thinking, their own consciousness, and practice critical thinking. He was a social activist, and he worked with impoverished, illiterate Brazilians. He didn't offer his students the answers to their plight, but he taught them to read and think critically so that they could come up with their own answers. You can imagine that this stirred things up in Brazil. He was jailed for subversion and then spent many years in exile, during which he taught at Harvard and spread his ideas around the world. In the US, the writer and social activist Bell Hooks says education is a form of resistance, and she calls teaching and learning revolutionary acts. The word education is related to the Latin word educere, which means to bring forth. It brings forth a critically thinking, whole person who's able to participate in the renewal or transformation of his or her society. Without it, minds are limited. It's hard to imagine options in your world if you have not been exposed to different frames of thinking and learned to examine your own. This is why Malala Yousafzai says that freedom is not meaningful without education. She's the young Afghan girl who was shot in the face by the Taliban for arguing that girls should have the same right to go to school that boys do. You don't have to have a college degree in order to think. Even a little bit of good education, even in informal settings and not necessarily in a school, can have extraordinary effects. It transforms the sense of self in relation to the world. This is why I say education is a deeply spiritual undertaking. And in the US, we've made it our mission to provide it to every child. In the 1800s, Emerson commented on the wild experiment of American public education, calling it the most radical of revolutions. "It is remarkable," he said, "that a poor man, whom the law does not allow to take an ear of corn when starving, nor a pair of shoes for his freezing feet, is allowed to put his hand into the pocket of the rich and say, 'You shall educate me.'" But in Emerson's time, there was also angst over the way we were doing it. Emerson himself called the schools a system of despair. saying, "We exercise their understandings of some facts, numbers, and words. We aim to make accountants, attorneys, and engineers, but not to make able, earnest, great-hearted people." It turns out that not only has public education been a source of angst for the last decade, every era in American history has had calls for reform. In one era, progressive reformers complained that schools were obsolete and out of step with the modern age. Later, other reformers, called essentialists, complained that schools had gone soft and students weren't learning as much as they once had. At the beginning of the 20th century, schools were accused of being too academic and not addressing the country's need for skilled workers. In the 1930s, during the Depression, reformers criticized the schools for not being able to keep students from dropping out and joining the ranks of the unemployed. In the 1940s, reformers said schools weren't preparing students for the real world. In the 50s, it was that they weren't covering the basics. In the 60s, schools were too academic and stifling and needed more spontaneity. And in the 70s, there was a backlash against spontaneity, and new testing regimes were started to make sure students were meeting the basics again. Back and forth, back and forth. Today, we again hear calls for reform, and they go something like this. Here's the narrative. American public schools are in decline, test scores are dismal, dropout rates are soaring, and we are falling behind other countries. According to the narrative, this is due to ineffective teaching and poor leadership. Therefore, poorly performing teachers must be fired, while high-performing teachers are rewarded, and in some cases, whole schools must be closed due to their performance. According to the same narrative, anyone who disagrees with those remedies is defending the status quo, or worse, defending teachers' unions, which, according to the narrative, are more interested in pensions than in students. In fact, New Mexico's teacher grading system not only ranks teachers based on their students' test scores, but on teacher compliance. That teacher who went from an A to a D said she was worried her score may be lowered even more if showing up at the Albuquerque interfaith meeting is considered resistance or non-compliance. That's what she said. That's the narrative. We've been hearing it for over a decade now. We've got to crack down on our failing system. Here's the problem with it. It's not true. A good education teaches critical thinking, the ability to gain insight by examining and not just absorbing the information that we're given. Ironically, that is the level of analysis missing from our nation's public conversation on education. Diane Ravitch is an education historian and a policy analyst. She was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education under both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. She says, the truth is, public schools are working very well for most students. Overall, test scores on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, are at an all-time high. I went onto the government website and checked this out for myself. It's true. Graduation rates are at an all-time high, too. A record number of students are going to college. And while it's true that we do not rank as high as other advanced nations on international tests, this does not represent a decline. We have performed poorly on international tests since they were introduced in the 1960s. Within the whole, some schools and specific districts have low scores and low graduation rates. Those districts also tend to have high rates of poverty. Here's the reality. Schools are in crisis wherever society is in crisis. That's the narrative we need to be paying attention to. Remember Emerson's image of the poor person who has no corn and no shoes but is entitled to free education? It's not so far off. Still, we really are providing education to kids who don't have some of their basic needs met for clothing, food, or health care, and we're expecting them to do as well as everyone else. According to the Columbia School of Public Health, almost half of children, 45%, live in low-income families, meaning their families may not be able to meet the most basic needs. And 1 out of every 4 children in America lives in poverty. which means their families earn half or less